right? So our parents have their expectations, and the young person is finding their place, and we don't meet, right? And that distance leads to the disconnect in that experience.
So a difference in culture. And then would you also say that what you just defined is intergenerational trauma?
Absolutely. Our biological signatures carry through our families.
Another episode of the Speak Real podcast, sharing one-on-one conversations. We believe that storytelling is the best way to empower youth and give them the platform to find their voices.
Presented by YouthSpeak. Youth experience, youth voice, youth empowered. I'm joined by Shivani Gupta, who is a clinical social worker and psychotherapist, and also the first mental health professional we've ever had on this podcast. Hi, Shivani. How's it going?
Going really well. Thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you for being a part of this. For anyone who is unfamiliar with what a clinical social worker and psychotherapist is, could you clarify what exactly it is that you do?
So a clinical social worker, psychotherapist is an individual that works with people and experiencing mental health or emotional challenges, as we all do in life. Pain is a common denominator to all of us. So it provides an opportunity for people to have a safe space where they can meet with somebody outside their family realm that can allow the space to talk about their life experiences, learn skills to help them regulate their emotions, learn some tools, and also reflect on their own experiences and make sense of it.
Awesome. I will introduce myself for the audience. I'm Varinder. I am the creative lead at YouthSpeak Performance Charity. I'm also a public speaker for YouthSpeak. I talk about my mental health journey, which involves self-image, processing overwhelming emotion, building my relationship with myself, a lot of which is fitting for the topic of today's podcast and why I was so enthused to speak with you. So Shivani has shared with me a few articles which are called Psychological Invalidation, Core Beliefs and Self-Acceptance, and Validating Your Feelings. I will be referencing these definitions from these articles for anybody watching who maybe is not familiar with these terms, and that will set the tone for this talk. So let's start this talk, Shivani. I wanted to start with a definition from one of those articles. So it reads, psychological invalidation is the act of rejecting, dismissing, or minimizing someone else's thoughts and feelings. It implies that a person's experience is unimportant, wrong, or unacceptable and causes greater psychological distress, which makes the recipient filled with self-doubt. For example, the phrase, "it could be worse," or "I'm sure it wasn't that bad." These statements minimize and marginalize someone's pain and force a toxic positivity on them. So this really resonated with me. I feel like I can try and understand what good intention that phrase could come from. I would assume gratitude, which is a great tool for self-improvement, but it's another thing when you're using gratitude, I think, or comparison to someone else to bypass your emotional response to something that happened to you. And I know that because I used to do this a lot. I would deny any idea or slight possibility that anything I experienced was abnormal because I thought, well, how could that be? I'm just as normal as everyone else. And then I got to this point where I could speak on the residual feelings I had from events that occurred in my life that still had an effect on me years later as an adult. But I would always end with the statement, but I know other people had it worse, so it's not that bad. And I thought that was just me trying not to make my life sound like a sob story. But it took me being asked, why do you invalidate and make excuses for your pain, for me to realize that's what I was doing. So I think sometimes it can start out as someone telling you that, and then you start telling yourself that. And that's the bigger danger because that's how it stays with you, even if that person stops or leaves.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Varinder. I think you've really highlighted how actually emotional invalidation can be a traumatic experience in itself, right? So when you talked about that, what I heard was that when somebody invalidates you, which means that they are not understanding or fully accepting the experience of the other. And most people don't do it purposely. It's just, the way they have been conditioned or not knowing any different. It often leaves the other person feeling that their experience is not important. And often that invalidation that comes externally can eventually be internalized, where we begin to internalize and invalidate our own experiences as if they don't matter, right? And it's often a conditioned response because you've learned to invalidate yourself to protect self in some way, and then developing a core belief that your experience is not important.
With that, I want to segue into my first question, which is, what are some things commonly unrecognized as mental or emotional abuse or trauma?
So when you think about emotional trauma or psychological trauma is any experience that one has had that has left a psychological injury on the brain. One of the differences between physical traumas and emotional traumas or psychological traumas is that in the physical traumas, you do see something visibly present that you can heal from over time, or something that gradually wears off. Psychological and emotional traumas are internalized at a much deeper level, where the wounds may not be visible to your eyes. However, the internalized experiences turns into negative core beliefs about self. So one may move away from an experience of a emotional injury as I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, something's wrong with me, I am unlovable. So emotional and psychological invalidation and traumatic experiences can lead to developing negative core beliefs about ourselves, which become the absolute truths with which we live our lives.
I think it's great to define that, because a lot of the time mental and emotional abuse gets left out of the conversation about abuse altogether. People understand physical abuse, but they may not even know that abuse can be mental or emotional.
Yeah, that's I agree with you, and I'm really excited about this topic and having this conversation in this forum, because I think it's really important to reach out to as many people possible in even becoming aware of what psychological and emotional trauma and abuses. I think pain and suffering is a common denominator to all of us. As we go through this pandemic together, it's a great example of how we all are impacted by a traumatic experience that has different levels of impact on all of us. Right. So I think that while one may not be aware sometimes of emotional psychological traumas, they exist for all of us. And recognition of that is the first place to be, so that we all can develop an emotional vocabulary that actually helps us name our experiences. Most often we may experience something and it is manifested in our behavior, but we really don't have a name or an understanding of what our internal experience is. So I think that's a really key piece in our self-awareness and growth.
I love that you use the pandemic as an example, because that's an example of us taking care of our physical health. But as a result of that, it's affected our mental health more than I think most people would have imagined. Right. And so it's like, okay, well, it's like a balancing act.
Right. Absolutely. And you know, I'm humbled to say that, you know, through this experience, there has been a significant surge in seeking out and reaching for mental health and emotional support because of the impact of the pandemic on people's lives. So that in itself is a traumatic experience that has stretched way longer than one could have ever imagined. So when we talk about trauma, going back to your original question about psychological emotional traumas, when we talk about trauma is any experience, and you know, it's the big T word that can be quite overwhelming when you hear about it, or one tends to even normalize that it wasn't that bad. So that in itself becomes invalidating. But trauma is any experience that we actually see as traumatic, like earthquakes, tsunamis, pandemic, robberies, sexual abuse. Those are traumatic experiences. And trauma is also experiences that can be disturbing for individuals, such as betrayals, rejections, humiliations. These are also traumatic experiences that get internalized over our time and can cause a lot of psychological pain.
So would you say trauma is more of people should look at it like it's a scale of, there's different varying degrees. Like I've heard losing your job is a type of, I've never would have thought of that example. Right. So it's a scale rather than this is trauma and this is not. It's not black and white.
Absolutely. And yes, and trauma is very personal to each person, because for someone who has lost a job, the meaning behind losing a job may be that this person is not able to support their family if they're the primary breadwinner of the family, or have somebody in the back who's in the hospital. So there are so many trauma in itself. It's the meaning attached to that event that causes the psychological injury.
And I think sometimes people maybe they don't label it as trauma, they'll label it as stress, but it probably is traumatic.
Right, absolutely. Okay. And so stress can be a byproduct of the traumatic experience.
I want to preface my next question, which is about parental expectations, because I know that's something you wanted to shed some light on with an example. So, and you're the expert, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So let's say something common in our community, in the Indian community, would be career paths. So maybe your parents actively discourage your choice in career, and it comes from a place of love that is defined as security. I want my child to have job security, income security. This is quite common in the Indian diaspora, I would say, living in the Western world, especially with the experience of our parents' generation being immigrants, comes that survival mindset. So from the parents' perspective, them discouraging what the child wants and encouraging what they themselves want for the child is believed to be in the child's best interest out of protection. That's one perspective. From the child's perspective, especially when they're very, very young, they may not even be able to comprehend that because it's too complex. So they may instead internalize, mom and dad don't support me, mom and dad don't love me, there must be something wrong with me. And these two perspectives happen at the same time and cause a rift in a parent-child relationship because they're opposite. Is that explanation fair to say?
Yes. And again, I think that a child growing up is always going to seek their parents for validation, for support, for direction, right? And I think one of the differences that happens in our communities, especially just keeping in the back of our mind that our parents who have been maybe immigrants to the country have gone through their own traumatic experiences. Immigration can be a traumatic experience where they have lost culture, networks, family ties, and come to a new land to make it, right? And when you go through that, there is this piece that really drives you about doing than being. Right. So it's so that belief that, the generation that arrives here brings with them, develops their core beliefs about how life should be. So that absolute truth about how life should be to be successful is a core belief that tends to guide their parenting journey of a child from the best interest in mind. And while it is well intended, it somewhere along the way can get in the way of understanding and assessing child's unique strengths and needs, right? So there is a bit of a kerfuffle that happens between that parent-child dynamic, while the child who has been born in Canada and is a part of the new environment and also reconciles with a home environment, home cultures and customs, goes into the new environment and has a very different experience than their parents who had their primary education in India or came from their own experiences. So there's that imposing happening, thinking about the child's best interest in mind, and not being able to incorporate child's needs or their exposure in this place. So there's a bit of a distance, a gap that grows unknowingly. And sometimes we just don't cross each other, right? So our parents have their expectations and the young person is finding their place and we don't meet, right? And that distance leads to the disconnect in that experience.
So a difference in culture. And then would you also say that what you just defined is intergenerational trauma?
Absolutely. Our biological signatures carry through our families, right? And I have to say that our parents do a great job in leaving that behind and coming because of the resilience that develops in being in a new place and working their way through to making it in the new land and making it their own, right? So there is a sense of loss that might not be visible, but happens. I know that with my own journey of growing up in India and coming to Canada in adult years, every time Diwali comes around or Holi comes around, or when I don't have an opportunity to celebrate the way I used to in India, there is some sort of a sadness that comes with that experience. While, I have developed a friend group here and a beautiful community that supports me, and my children are growing up here. So this is their familiar ground. There is, and I choose to be a part of embracing both cultures, both experiences, there is a sense of sadness and loss that comes with it. And in acknowledging that, I can move forward than leaving it behind, right? So sometimes those experiences can lead to those challenges in not being able to validate or see through the young person's experience, right? And again, core beliefs play a great role in that, where, growing up, a lot of our families were conditioned to, be certain professionals. And if you were not that professional, then that wasn't okay. In my own story, when I was growing up, my father really wanted for me to become a doctor. I was fortunate enough that I did well academically. And when I told him that I was going to study social work, it was really hard for him. And he did everything possible to take me to, our family friends that were in positions of professional positions that were the professions in the day and the time, to convince me otherwise. Right. So those were, I can chuckle about that now because I know how proud my father feels today about my own experiences. However, that was a really difficult place for him. And when I think back, it was informed by his own journey of survival growing up. He grew up and he was, went through significant trauma of losing his father to riots during the partition. And so growing up independently, that informs your core belief about survival and what is best in life. So that really has an influence. So I think all these factors are to be taken into account as parents are working in parenting their children, and developing a better awareness of their needs, in addition to their own experiences of working through their challenges.
It's difficult as a child to understand that. And then when you get older, you realize, okay, so my parents didn't even have that parenting themselves. How could you even pass on something you're not familiar with? So right. My question is, how would you decipher as parental expectations that cross the line from healthy to unhealthy?
I think it's a really blurry line, right? First and foremost, because, a lot of our parenting, a lot of our communication with our children is influenced by so many factors: culture, norms, our core beliefs, our religious beliefs. And there is also this hierarchy in our culture about family ties, right? And how that transition through families. So I think there isn't a simple answer to the question. And as I'm living through my own life experiences, I'm learning as I go as well. But what I can say is that when it crosses a line would be when we impose our expectations and beliefs on our children without the opportunity to give our children the opportunity to be heard, right? So a child, regardless of their age, is capable of experiences, of emotions, and capable of communicating those experiences. And our role as parents becomes to be able to give it an active listening ear and understand those experiences for what it is, right? So because we have had certain experiences in our life doesn't necessarily mean that those are the experiences that will guide our children's journey as well, right? That they will play an important role in influencing their journey. And I think incorporating and validating our children's experiences that are unique to them, because we may not have those experiences, especially if we haven't gone to school here, right? If parents haven't gone to school here, then it is very difficult to understand what it means to fit into a diverse community. Or when, I remember a story where one of a young client of mine said to me, I was really bullied at school for the color of my skin. And when I went to told my dad said, man up and be brave, right? Stand up to them, right? Which makes sense. And a father is really trying to be helpful to the child. However, it is very difficult when you don't see the color of your skin and others do, and equipping them with resources and supports would be important. So I think those are certain things that cross the line, I would say.
You mentioned core beliefs, and I think you defined it. I was going to read that definition off, but I think you already defined it. And I was going to ask if you're comfortable sharing any personal experience you've had with a negative core belief, but I guess that example was your career path. So I just want to say it's great that you're comfortable sharing that, because I think it's important for a lot of people to hear that. Even professionals whose job it is to help you also sometimes need help themselves. And it's useful to share that for anyone seeking help and feels alone because of it.
Absolutely. I think one of the most common, I could say, through my work experiences and my lived experiences, a common negative core belief that we all mostly struggle with is self-doubt, right? Not worthy, not good enough. And there have been many experiences in my life where I have come to that crossroads of not feeling good enough. And that feeling is yucky and debilitating within us, right? Where we feel less than even for ourselves. And so, in professional self, in personal life, there are many times that I have felt that way. And to become aware now that that's a negative core belief and is rooted in, it's almost like this negative core belief is like that absolute truth that lives in the basement of your house. And every now and then, when there's a stimulus that shows up, we go into the basement of the house to consult that core belief. And it's so convincing and it's so persuasive that it almost makes you believe that that is the ultimate truth. So we want to continue to go to the basement and challenge those things and actually collect some garbage along the way and put it in the dumpster, right? Because there are core beliefs that we may have lived by through our experiences or through conditioning of childhood. When we become aware that they are negative core beliefs, we have the opportunity to change them. And I invite everybody to consider that in challenging some of the core beliefs that don't hold true.
I love the analogy of the basement in your house. The back of your mind, it's not necessarily a conscious belief, although like you probably don't even know you have that.
So there's a lot of purging that we all need to do every now and then.
Yeah, for sure. Let's pretty heavy topic. Let's segue into something else. It'd be pretty ironic if we were talking about mental health in the Indian community, not to mention yoga and meditation. I know you're a certified yoga teacher. In what ways do you think yoga and meditation or mindfulness has an effect on a person's mental health and well-being?
Yoga, well, let's put it this way, that the human body is suited for gentleness. And which means that I think about yoga as it's embracing and soothing your body to be able to handle the vicissitudes of life that we go through. So I think that our soul resides in our body, and every now and then our experiences are challenged and the body takes toll. So when the body is suited for gentleness, yoga is a way of regulating your body. So, if you ever attend a yoga class, there's a real focus on breath work. And breath work is really to ground you, because breath is something that can always center you in yourself. So when somebody is activated or there is a experience that is causing distress, you'll note that your breathing changes. One tends to breathe shallow, and the body gets tensed up. So breathing, mindfulness, meditation is the way to calm the body down. And for some of us who practice postures in yoga, focusing on postures is also a way on just drawing attention to the body, out of your mind into your body, to center yourself. So, yoga has a great place of pacing ourselves to calm the body down. If you think about trauma, so again, trauma being intense experiences in life of individuals that have left a memory lasting longer than the time that the event took place. Trauma is often stored in our body and in our feelings. So yoga is a great way of helping regulate our emotional experiences. So breath work, mindfulness, which is being in the present moment with awareness. Mind plays tricks on us all the time. So we either think about living in the past or we live in the future. The should, the could, the would, the must, all are either future related or past related. I could have done better. I must have been so stupid. All those experiences are either futuristic or past. But we really, where we do have control is in the present moment. So yoga and mindfulness is about being in the present moment with awareness, which is where we have control, which is where we have the capacity and the strength to regulate ourselves. So that practice can be really, really helpful. I know through my challenging experiences in life where I couldn't find a way to regulate myself. I remember walking into the yoga studio, and it was just about the act of being in that space that was just calming and allowing me to work through it. And I can talk about that with you today because I was able to overcome that.
There's like so many things you said that I want to talk about. So when I practice yoga, it's not something I can describe in words. It's almost like it lets you feel that you're really in a body. It reminds me, okay, I have a body, and that body needs tending to. And then you said something about trauma being stored in the body. I've also heard the explanation that many physical ailments can have an emotional root cause.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say so?
Absolutely. I really I truly believe that. Like I said earlier, I'm humbled by working with people in my private practice that often will come in with high levels of emotional dysregulation, high levels of anxiety, or situational distress or depression that actually shows up in the body. So, heart palpitations, or feeling like I'm having a heart attack, or have been to the hospital many times with false alarms thinking that they're having a heart attack, but it was a panic attack. Right. And which can actually, right. So actually,
no, sorry to interrupt you. I love that you bring that up, because I don't think people understand the severity of what an anxiety or a panic attack can feel like. I've also heard it compared to running a mile. Is that
right?
Okay.
Yeah. And people often describe that feeling as completely debilitating. It takes over, and you just want to get rid of that feeling within. And that's when sometimes we are drawn to behaviors that can be very adaptive in the moment, but actually maladaptive in the long run, like numbing, avoiding, self-soothing through using substances, alcohol, marijuana, to suppress that intense feeling that happens within. Right. So so much of our human experience that is labeled as toxic is usually a way of coping, which is unhealthy in the long run, which is usually a way of coping with some of the psychosomatic experiences that can get manifested in the body. Right. So I think it's really important to recognize that, because everything begins with the mind.
Yeah, I definitely agree with using the word coping is when something can get unhealthy. Like the way I do yoga and meditation now, though I used to do it years ago, but I would do it in order to escape my feelings. I was running from myself essentially. And so that you don't really get healed in that way, because I started to compartmentalize, and that's where I got this real just like self-hatred. And when I just sat with everything, and I went to a professional to do this, but I sat with all my feelings, and I went through countless memories and things. It was a very meditative process. I think it's referred to as soul retrieval. And it really made me okay with negative emotions. We talked about that toxic positivity, right? Negativity as in itself bad. But if you think about the human experience, it has both pain and pleasure. Like those are just natural.
Absolutely.
Touch a hot stove, it's your sign not to do that again. So accepting a lot of parts in me that were hurting was how I helped heal myself. And so now when I meditate, it's not to escape my thoughts or my anxiety or to get away from myself. Because when I was doing it that way, it's like, you can't meditate 24 hours a day. I can't exercise 24 hours a day. I have to stop at some point, and then the everything starts again, like the negative thoughts and everything. So now it's at a point of, okay, I accept all the parts of myself, and I just am going to support myself no matter how I feel, whether or not the world agrees. You have to support yourself in whatever emotion you feel.
I completely echo what you're saying, Varinder. It really holds true for me, and also in my work, because as I've learned more, I've moved away from this idea of positive and negative emotions, because each emotion there plays a certain role, and emotions are your body's alarm system that tells you something's going on, and we have to listen to it. So the work through our pain is not taking a detour from our emotions. It is accepting our emotions and working our way through it. And I'm hearing what you're saying, that when we can sit with our emotions, when we learn to tolerate our emotions, which are there for a reason, which are there for experiences we've had, then we grow resilient through them.
Yeah, I almost feel like your emotions are meant to say something to you, and you only know that if you're listening. But if you're trying to run away, you're not
Right.
sure what that is. And that's all it's trying, all your emotion is trying to get you to do is to listen. And then I've noticed it will just like fizzle out on its own, because they are
Right.
temporary. And the
Yeah.
harder we suppress them, the longer they stay.
Absolutely, and shout out to you for saying that out loud, because I think that earlier to your question about message to the community as well, is that kind of debunking the stigma around emotions not being okay, or debunking the idea that you always have to present strong, right? So presenting strong includes presenting vulnerability.
Exactly. Mental health is something so stigmatized inside and outside our community. And on top of that, like you said before, it's not something that necessarily shows or that you can prove. I have seen for myself I guess there is a way it can show on the outside in terms of behavior. Say, for example, someone has a particular reaction to something. That reaction in itself is very telling. And the questions that I've learned from myself to decipher like what's going on would be, okay, well, what am I really reacting to? Is this a surface level thing? Is this something deeper? What did it make me feel? Why did it make me feel that way? What you said, core beliefs do I have about it? Where did I get those from? And how can I resolve this? But the thing is, you wouldn't recognize that unless you knew what to look for and what questions to ask. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think when you were saying that, I had this image of how the human brain works, right? So the brain develops from the bottom part, right? So the primitive part of the brain, which is our brain stem, is where the brain develops up from. So we've got the brain stem, we've got the emotional brain, and then we have the learning brain. And when a stimulus is presented, uh, to be able to access the learning part of the brain, it works its way up, bottom up. So when you find first is the primitive brain, which is the fight and flight mode of the brain that fires up. So to be able to get to the upper story, we have to work the bottom up. And if the primitive part of the brain is, which we also call the reptilian brain, if the primitive part of the brain is perceiving that particular event as threatening, it acts up, right? Even though this may not be a threatening event. So moving into that flight and fight mode doesn't allow. So one may have a reaction to something which can be a trauma response, right? So for example, if I grew up and when I was a child, my aunt told me, go to sleep, otherwise the dog will come and bite you. The primitive brain gets conditioned to the dog equals bite. And even though I may have not have had any experiences growing up where the dog had bitten me, when I am an adult and a dog walks down, my primitive brain, because that's what takes up the information up, fires up and saying, stay away, this is danger. I may not remember that my aunt, when I was 5 years old, said that to me, but the brain keeps a memory and gets activated, right? So when we tap into going into the basement, taking those beliefs out, recognizing what the origin of those are, we can train our learning brain to learn and look out for false alarms.
So in terms of like the unconscious mind, you said, so it's, I think what I've heard is from the ages of 0 to like approximately 8 is where you have all this information that becomes the unconscious mind. So people, even in the age of 20, 30, 40, 90, are still running on that same programming they had at the age of 5. Is that correct?
Right. So I think what we know is that, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but what we know is that as the unconscious brain is developing, and the children often don't remember their experiences at least till the age of 3 or 4, and some of us don't remember. I don't have a very good memory of remembering any of that before I was maybe 8 or 10 myself. But what we do know, and what we are finding more, is that the body and the mind keeps score. It may not be a part of your conscious awareness. However, one can have a visceral reaction, or the body can respond if a triggering experience in childhood gets stimulated in adult years.
I've also heard, so the reason people, I guess children would forget their trauma is that the brain isn't matured enough to process it. So it stores it in the subconscious. And then that's why you get 20-year-olds who then are depressed and they don't know why. And so it'll come back in when the brain is mature enough to be able to process that. But you may not know, like, consciously, okay, but what happened to me? Like, why do I feel this way?
Right. Yeah. And so trauma is not often remembered as a memory, especially if it's been in the early years, where a child doesn't remember if it was a trauma in childhood. Trauma is often remembered in symptoms, right? So symptoms can show up as anxiety, depression, isolation, self-harm, shaming of self, right? Trauma also influences developing negative core beliefs about self. So you're right that and when a traumatic event happens in the life of a person, in the moment, the brain only has a certain amount of capacity to absorb the experience. So it absorbs a small part of that experience, and rest of the experience gets deeply embedded in the memory deep inside that may not be accessible then. And that's why sometimes later in years, an adult might recall traumatic experiences and would think, oh my God, how come I'm thinking about this now? Because there is a certain way that brain tends to save the memory that has been traumatic to protect self, and so that the self can continue to be present in everyday living, and the trauma doesn't hold the person back.
So my question pertaining to all that is, what would you say are some behavioral signs, inner or outer, of someone who's been mentally or emotionally abused?
So I think that, like I was saying earlier, that mental or emotional abuse or traumatic experiences as defined by them can lead to developing certain ways of coping that the individual gets into to help cope through that. So some of the behavioral signs can be self-sabotaging behaviors that individual may get to. So, self-harm is one of them. Substance use, alcohol, drug use can be ways that individuals cope. High level of avoidance, oversleeping, undersleeping can also be a traumatic response. Anxiety, depression, or inability to focus, irritability, or difficulty with relationships can also be a result of emotional and psychological traumatic experiences. We know that children who have had early experiences of childhood invalidation, or on that continuum of emotional and psychological trauma, often can have disorganized attachments, where there is this this kerfuffle within, or that you're not sure if you should run towards that visual of a caring, secure, safe figure, or run away from. So flight and fight mode can develop often if one goes through that. There's a really good study called the ACE study, which talks about adverse childhood experiences that can be traumatic, and can help draw some insight into how children cope with childhood experiences, and what could be some of the behavioral manifestations of that.
I wanted to ask you that because I feel things like that are really easily overlooked. And I hear a lot of, oh, that wasn't abuse. It happens to a lot of kids in this community or that community or this part of the world.
Right.
And I don't understand that, because for me, when I look at it logically, unhealthy behaviors or beliefs being common in a society doesn't make them healthy. Say we all faced a common dysfunction, it doesn't magically mean it's now functional. So for you, having you as a psychotherapist validating what emotional abuse even means, despite that very strange popular opinion, I think helps break down that ideology. And so for anyone listening who is ever confused about whether or not what you experienced was emotionally or mentally healthy, or on the other end, abusive, I would just ask a professional and seek help if needed. Have you ever heard the phrase, your parents did the best that they could?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
very common in our community as well. And
Right.
it's a valid phrase, and
Yeah.
you know, it could be true. Maybe your parents did do the best they could. And
Right.
I want to get across the point again for any youth that are listening, whether or not intentional, unfortunately, the effects of psychological and emotional invalidation or abuse or trauma don't just go away because it wasn't done on purpose. So all of these things can be true, that yes, your parents tried their best, and at the same time, maybe their parenting style had certain abusive or neglectful tendencies, and at the same time it wasn't done with that intention. At the same time, they love you, but at the same time their child is still mentally and emotionally affected by all that. So it's still, no matter all of these things, it's still something a person has to work through and heal, no matter what. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think just to add to what you're saying, I truly believe that each individual's experience is obviously different, and trauma is personal to each individual, right? Their experience of um, um, emotional injuries that may have happened in their experiences, either in their immediate home, or within extended family, or within another scope of the environment, is a personal experience. And that's where we want to really focus on emotional psychological validation, where regardless of what the other person thinks, if that's your experience, then that's something that needs to be honored and recognized, that it's important and valuable. And in most cases, most parents do the best they can from what they know. And this conversation is certainly not to negate those very important experiences and efforts of our families, our generations, to provide or their vision to provide a better support system and provide the best for their families and generations to come. This is not to diss those experiences. It is to draw attention and awareness to what are some of the factors that one may not be aware of, and they go unnoticed, right? Because psychological, emotional trauma and it can continue, like you said, intergenerationally as well, because we are not aware of them. And the more we become aware of them, we have an opportunity to make a change and evolve, because the human brain is very resilient, and has the ability to recover and heal. So the focus is not what we need to fix. The focus is how we evolve and how we heal collectively.
Mm-hmm. It's like that phrase, children go to therapy for their parents who won't.
Mm.
You know, it
Right.
definitely ties into that intergenerational trauma. And it's also like, well, if you've never learned that something was even abusive, how are you supposed to know? Or maybe they're thinking, oh, but it happened to me, I was raised that way and I'm fine, right? But even that definition of fine, are we even looking into what exactly that means?
Absolutely. And again, we want to challenge some of those the beliefs that therapy is if you are broken, if something is wrong with you. Therapy is a process to co-create a space where you can explore and talk about your experiences and grow from them, right? And learn skills in changing the narrative, and working way through some of those emotional feelings of hurt, and understanding what has happened to you rather than what is wrong with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the key part, and also to debunk some of the myths and the stigma attached to that. We don't seek therapy, or sometimes parental core belief is that if my child goes to therapy, then there's something wrong with my parenting, right?
Or there's
So
something wrong with my child.
right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. So all those factors, a very complex place Varinder?
Yeah, I think we may have a different understanding of therapy if, say, when like I remember being in elementary school and we would have dentists come to the school and do a checkup. If we could have a mental health professional do that, it may reduce some of that stigma, because it doesn't have to be that you have a problem that you need to fix, like you said. It can just be you're working on your general mental health and well-being.
Right, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really key. And I think the fabric of understanding emotional and psychological treatments as really valuable and important is changing. It's evolving,
Yeah.
and you see more and more of that. We now have psychotherapists, social workers in schools. There's more opportunity for youth to access guidance counselors and additional support through them in the school system. YouthSpeak is a great voice in the school that makes in sharing stories of resilience through adversity, allows people to understand that they are not alone, and access those supports for themselves.
The unique thing about YouthSpeak is that all of our speakers are youth themselves. So sometimes it does help when teens hear stories from 20-year-olds and they think, okay, well, if it was possible for them, it could be possible for me as well.
Absolutely. I know before the pandemic days, I had some wonderful opportunities to witness presentations that YouthSpeak made in schools and in assemblies. And it's very energizing to just see youth come together and talk about their experiences and share common grounds, and the collective strength in working through that.
We mentioned the difference between our understanding of, I guess, societal understanding of mental and emotional health is not as advanced as physical health. And I think even in Western culture, right, like that's not specific to our community, but sometimes its existence itself isn't even acknowledged. You might have heard someone say, oh, but you have shelter and food and income, how could you be depressed? Or, oh, but you look fine. Part of my own healing process while getting help was to communicate with my parents on exactly what it was I was feeling, why, and what I needed. I now understand that they weren't brought up in a way that would even have equipped them with knowing the kind of emotional parenting style I needed as a child. And so I sort of took on that initiative in order to continue our relationship in the best way I feel that we could have. That's easier as an adult to do than I think it would have been in my teens. So relating to that, what is your advice for youth struggling with their relationship with their parents who maybe don't have that emotional awareness to understand that their child is hurting and needs help?
I think the first place to start would be to start validating your experiences bottom up. The external experience usually manifests what's happening internally. So a place to start, I always think, is the foundation is building relationship with self. So once you begin to recognize negative core beliefs about self, working on places where you work on validating your own experiences, because sometimes when we haven't felt the validation, we lose connection with self and rely on others to validate us. So seeking external validation to fill us on the inside. So there's a bit of a flip that needs to happen, which is to recognize and challenge your own core beliefs and looking to validate your own experiences, acceptance of your emotions, and allowing yourself to feel and heal. Right? So so that would be one place to go, and accessing experiences and also people in your life that if it is not within the certain environment that you live in, then seeking those experiences and seeking trusted adults in your life that can provide you that support, be it with a professional, be it with a friend, be it with a teacher, or extended family. So really beginning to creating a safe space and including people in your life that can inform your journey of healing and working your way through. When there's been a series of judgments, internalized beliefs about self, and one tends to protect self by pushing them away. When you keep knocking on the same door all the time, then somewhere it creates a cracks and comes in. and we tend to internalize those experiences. So I think the first place to be would be to take a good scan of your own self and start working on treating yourself and loving yourself, um, which would be at the foundation of the beginning of the work.
I love that you said the inner work will
Yeah.
manifest itself on the outside. I've heard stories of people who worked on themselves, and then in turn that somehow changed the relationship they had maybe with their parents, because they did that work themselves, and they started with their own, like you said, validating things that weren't validated from other people.
Absolutely. The biggest strength lies within us, and you always have yourself to rely on. And when we begin to recognize that disturbing experiences have impacted us in a certain way, rather than those disturbing experiences are us, then we can safely create some distance from those experiences, and resource us, fill us with some, fuel us and fill us with with resources that help to nurture self. Right? We talked about yoga earlier. We talked about challenging negative core beliefs. We've talked about doing some purging from the basement, and working your way on accessing positive supports that can help you build strength and courage.
Right. Okay, let's flip that now. So what would you say to parents who maybe aren't familiar with the kinds of emotional and psychological stresses that youth can have, in terms of what could they be, how to talk to your child about it in a healthy way, how to get help?
I think that the biggest piece is, when you become aware of certain experiences that has impacted your relationship with your child, then change begins to happen, because change is always preceded by a vision. And when you become aware, the shift begins to happen automatically. So a place to start is to engage in active listening. A child as young as right after birth, when the child is born, is able to communicate, maybe not verbally but non-verbally, and express their needs. So the foundation is set from the very beginning, and starting to connect with the person, and listening to them, validating their experience, would be a place to start, because everything begins with the relationship, right? Where when you're able to connect with the person, you don't need many things common to be able to connect with the person in a relational place. So sometimes the goal is not, when somebody is in the analogy of somebody sitting in a hole, and the human draw is to often pull somebody out of the hole, right? So you put a rope in and you're pulling the person out of the hole, and sometimes that's not what is helpful, and because parents would likely want to rescue children, and difficult seeing their pain, sometimes it is really about digging a larger hole and making yourself available in that space, so that it creates a safe space to expand, and really talk about what happens in that space together.
That rescue analogy really makes sense. It's very common for us to look at feelings that are heavy as negative, and okay, we need to throw those out. And so you're not seeing what is there something here to be seen? There's value in feeling that way.
Right, absolutely. And sitting with distressing feelings, right? To being able to tolerate painful emotions is an important part of growth in our life. And we all go through that experience. Usually our disposition is wanting to change those feelings. And sometimes we cannot, right? So expanding the space and creating opportunities to be in the being mode rather than the doing mode can be very helpful in expanding and strengthening the relationship.
Again, something very, very common. We don't really talk about what it means to just be.
Yeah, I think that's generally how we all are wired, right? The doing mode, right? So there's a structure, there's a routine, and if you look at the larger picture of going through this pandemic, a lot of are relying today to be able to cope with shutdowns and lockdowns and keeping safe, has been about in the being mode. because we cannot do all those external things that can be stimulating, and resorting to your own internal resources of self-soothing, of grounding yourself, and calming yourself are the ways that we have been able to work through. We're still working through a lot of it, and in for the long haul for sure. But those are the experiences that is going to help us work through this time as well.
Well, the one maybe good thing we've got from this pandemic is people are at least now getting more aware of the fact that their mental health is something that needs to be tended to.
Right. And Brene Brown has a really powerful quote that's always resonated with me. And she says that we're never meant to do it alone. So reaching out and accessing support in whatever shape and form it comes is really key to healing.
You talked about a child would always want their parents' validation. So in a situation where a child did not receive that validation, when they grow up and they have that trauma with them, does that go away, or is that something you still is stuck with you? Like, how would you even process that? Because you said a lot of it should be yourself, like work on yourself, but how do you deal with that missing link that still feels like, okay, but there's a void here. How do I fill this? Or do you fill it at all?
Right. I think that, again, as human beings, attachment is innate in us, and that's our core need to our growing up, to feel secure and safe. And as you become aware, if some have had unfortunate experiences where that wasn't available to them because of life experiences or what was happening at that time. When you become aware of that, then people can heal from those experiences and create secure attachments in adult years, in understanding again what has happened to us, in having an awareness of those experiences can help move away from some of the coping that may have developed to cope with those situations, and access some relationships that feel secure and can fill that void of attachment, right? And sometimes in that understanding and acceptance, one can heal from those experiences as well. And when we can heal from them, when we can understand from them, it creates a little bit of distance from it, rather than living in that that vortex all the time, because sometimes one doesn't realize again that we are living in the primitive part of the brain and the learning brain doesn't open. But when we are able to accept that that was our experience then and it's different now, one can heal from those experiences and foster new connections that can fill that up.
And so that limiting part of the brain would have to do with survival?
The primitive part of the brain, the survival brain.
Sorry, primitive.
Yes.
Did I say limiting part? I don't know what I just said.
Yeah, that's but
part, yes.
I know we meant the same thing.
Yeah, that really relates. My experience with anxiety was sort of like that when I broke it down. A lot of what it would make me feel is that this thing is dangerous. But when I looked at logically what that thing was, it was the feeling of it was more dangerous than the actual thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes sense to me that you say it's linked with survival. So a technique that I was introduced to that helped me is called reparenting yourself. So not an easy task, but I would say it was worth it, because the reason why it's difficult is because it feels like you're changing what normal is to you, which can be, like you said, those core beliefs sometimes you don't want to let go, or like they're just too deeply rooted in there. But that, like, it's just a very empowering method where you can provide yourself with those things that you felt you didn't get. And now you as an adult can parent yourself in that way and heal, like you said, that void. Reparenting.
I'm not familiar with that term, okay. So thank you for introducing that to me. But it's when you said that, it drew my awareness to self-soothing and healing practices within self, where one has the capability of nurturing self.
That's exactly
right.
It, yeah.
And one understands that and accepts that I may not have had that then. However, I can have this now. I can feel safe now. I can connect with that part of self that needs nurturing and honors that nurturing is important to self.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's never too late to heal those
No,
things. Okay,
no,
awesome.
it's ongoing. Nurturing is nurturing, and healing is an ongoing process that we're going to have it through a lifetime.
Good point. Yeah, that's another myth that like you fix yourself and then that's it. But it is an ongoing, it's like exercise. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, yeah, and fixing is required when something is broken.
Yeah, even though fix yourself. You're right about that.
Right. And so this is, as life experiences happen to us, distress shows up. And as we're learning along the way and evolving, we're also reaching out and seeking ways where we can regulate ourselves, continue to challenge judgments that we have about ourselves, others, or the world, and really rely on our core values and continue to challenge the core beliefs that don't hold true anymore for us.
We're getting to the end of our talk and I'm kind of sad about it. This has been really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, my last question for you, Shivani, is how did you get into this line of work of clinical social work and psychotherapy? And just tell me a little bit about your practice, your clinic.
When you asked me that question, I know I had an opportunity to think about this question a little bit before our interview today, Varinder. I was actually quite grateful for the question because I hadn't thought about it for a long time. What I realized was that as I think back on the question about what motivated me to be in the field, I think that there is so much to it because I've become more informed of it as I've gone along. So when I was growing up, my grandmother, who was a single parent to my father, who she adopted when he was 19 years old, my biological grandmother and my adopted grandmother were best friends. My father had lost his father during, as I had mentioned earlier, during the independence movement during the partition, and my grandmother took on my father, and we became a family. The story of adoption, the stories I heard about the independence movement was really inspiring. And it really motivated me. My grandmother came from a family of freedom fighters, so she often talked about that. This is dating back to 1947. So some of her family members had fought in India's freedom movement. And she was a social worker herself. Growing up, she had a lot of public presence, and she was instrumental in rehabilitation of women that had lost their families or separated from their families and children during the partition. So growing up, there were many, I had an opportunity to meet many women that my grandmother worked with in the rehabilitation centers and working on reuniting them with their families. So that was a really inspiring experience that I witnessed. I don't know if it was something that I knew then, but now I know now that had made an impression on my life. And I also grew up with many family members who had learning disabilities, mental health concerns, loss in the family, and really became quite sensitive to the language that was used growing up in identifying these people. And again, coming from a place of not being informed, many hurtful words can be used that can really injure people and the family members who are differently abled than what fits the norm. Again, that challenges the core belief around how we should be than who we are. So I remember having a very defensive stance in protecting some of my family members who went through some very difficult experiences and how it impacted our family. And I think all that shaped in me finding my way to reconnect with my own sensitivities, my own vulnerabilities, and then being in a position when I learned more about it to be able to work with individuals in strengthening and just being honoring our own experiences and individual selves.
I did not expect that answer to have so much depth and history and all this resilience. That was an amazing answer. I'm happy.
I'm actually, I obviously it couldn't, it's not something you can prepare, but as I'm talking to you, I can tell my audiences that my heart is fluttering because it does bring up all those intensities of our life experiences. And so we can't leave those experiences behind. They inform the making of ourselves, right? So we are all an institution of our experiences and can write our own stories as we evolve, as we grow and become aware of them.
Mm-hmm. So becoming grateful for all the things that maybe weren't positive, but they've created who you are today.
Absolutely. They have, I'm really grateful for all those experiences because they have shaped who I am today.
So you didn't get into your clinic. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I have a private practice in Richmond Hill, and I have been in private practice for a few years now. And prior to that, I worked in the nonprofit sector, specifically in addictions and mental health for about 19 years. And I still do some consulting with some of the organizations in the region, and I really value the work that we do as a community, and really grateful to be a part of this community where I have the ability to give back. In my own private practice, I specifically work with trauma. So I am certified as an Emdr Therapist, and Emdr is a specialty modality that is used to help individuals who have been through traumatic experiences. So it's a kind of exposure therapy. And I also have trained in dialectical behavioral therapy, which really focuses on developing behavioral skills in individuals in helping working through emotional dysregulation and developing skills for distress tolerance. So that's me, and I'm also connected with YouthSpeak in many capacities. During the early days of YouthSpeak, I had the honor of working very closely with Una, who is the founder of YouthSpeak, and it's really energizing and inspiring to see the growth with YouthSpeak and the opportunity to meet all the speakers. So thank you for this.
For anyone listening, how can people get in touch with you?
So I'm not very tech savvy, as I was saying to Varinder. So I'm striving for that. But I do have a website. It's oakridgetherapy.com. My contact information is also available there. I'm also on Psychology Today. You can look up Shivani Gupta and find me there. I usually meet with people for a consultation. There's no charge for the consultation to be able to understand their needs, and also for the person who's calling to have a better sense and understand if they think that the services that we provide here at Oak Ridges Therapy Center are suited to what they're looking for. Reaching out is the first step to making a change for yourself. And I encourage everybody to do that when required.
I think we both agree on that. Those are all my questions. So Shivani, thank you so much for doing this with me. I've so enjoyed our conversation, and you've given incredible value. Thank you again for being a part of this.
Thank you, Varinder. I really had a good time as well. I know we were both looking forward to it, and I'm glad this has come together. And I also want to thank you for your very insightful questions. It really made me think, and I think it was a little bit of my own self-reflection I was doing through this process as well. And so I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
If you want to hear more stories, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like. To support more youth by youth-led projects, visit us at youthspeak.ca, where you can donate and spread youth mental health awareness.
YouthSpeak Performance Charity. Speak, inspire, change.